Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at 5 secrets of story structure, how to write a novel that stands out by K.M. Weiland. In this book we will be dipping our toes into the concept of story structure. There are a number of different books on this topic and I hope to go through a number of those to help us give us a well-rounded idea of what we're talking about here. As always, I will be skipping a lot of important information in the book, so please go check it out for yourself. I will be linking all the resources I use in the description below. So without further ado, let's get into the book. 5 Secrets of Story Structure: How to Write a Novel That Stands Out by K.M. Weiland. Introduction. If there's just one thing that matters to your success as a writer, it's story structure. Story structure is what allows authors to create stories that work every single time. Story structure is what allows you to quickly diagnose and remedy plot problems. The fear that story structure is formulaic and difficult couldn't be further from the truth. In the following pages, you're going to learn how to master these 5 structural elements: the inciting event, the key event, the pinch points, the moment of truth, and the climactic moment. When it comes to plot, we normally tend to rely on instinct rather than using a structure. But for a lot of people, this doesn't always work, and issues begin to pop up within the story. As I said before, as writers, we are looking to take our readers into another world, to forget that they are even reading at all. Chapter 1. How to structure your novel in 5 minutes. 10 steps to story structure. Whether you're a discovery writer or a plotter, story structure can help you prop up your story to make it easier for your readers. That being said, as well as with other writing advice, these are just tools that can help us. It is impossible to connect equally with all readers, and some methods of writing connect better with some readers than others. In the end, our story is our own, and regardless of how it is received, you'll come out on the other side better off for having learned how to write better. The first act. Point 1. The hook. What is it? Your story first begins with the hook. This is your first opportunity for catching your reader's attention and convincing them to read on. You'll find this in the first portion of the story. This is what gets your readers off the first pages. Point 2. The inciting event. What is it? The inciting event is the turning point in the first act when your character first brushes with the story's main conflict. This is where the events between the start of your book and the inciting event become important, as it has given your readers the desire to follow your main character. The key event. What is it? If the inciting event is where your protagonist first encounters the main conflict, the key event is what irrevocably changes your protagonist with that conflict. If we see our story as a journey, this is the first time your character comes across the hill, forcing them to push forwards towards the goal that has been set before them. Will they find the strength to continue? Point 4. The first plot point. What is it? The first plot point marks the end of the first act and the beginning of the second. This is where everything changes for your character. This is the result or consequence of your character's choice to continue. It's not enough that the way is hard, but there must always be a cost to that choice. Point 5. The first half of the second act. What is it? Your protagonist is going to spend the first half of the second act in reaction mode. How are they dealing with the cost? Are they faltering, stealing themselves, blaming others for their situation? But remember, they need to be doing something. It normally doesn't matter what they are doing, but they have to do something. Point 6. The midpoint. What is it? The midpoint is your story's second major plot point. This is where everything changes again. Is everything your character thought about correct? Do they now know the truth of what's going on? Point 7. The second half of the second act. What is it? After the midpoint, your character is going to start going on the offensive. He's no longer going to be willing to simply have the antagonist bring the battle to him. Your character has come this far, right? But now that they know there's a cost, will they engage with the conflict? There can't be any wavering now, or all is lost. Point 8. The third plot point. What is it? The third plot point, as your final major plot point, is going to change everything once again. Whatever happens here is going to force your character to a low place. Has everything they went through been worth it? Is it worth it to continue? What would be the cost to give up? Why should your readers be cheering for your character to continue on? Point 9. The climax. What is it? Your climax is the point of the whole story. This is where the conflict must finally be resolved, for good and for all, one way or the other. It is the whole focus of the story. Do they rise up and win, or are they cast down in defeat? Point 10. The resolution. What is it? The resolution caps your story with finality. This important scene is your exhale to your climax inhale. Here, You give the readers opportunity to see how your character will react to the events of the climax. If they win, are they recovering from the battle or are they celebrating? If they are defeated, are they planning their revenge or gathering allies to overcome the enemy? Chapter 2. The Inciting Event. Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark opens with the famous sequence that Indy, dogged by his nemesis Belloc, infiltrates a South American temple and steals the golden idol. As we can see in Indiana Jones, we are not only given an introduction to the character, but also setting up important character issues, like how snakes really bother him, or how he has a nemesis. While some would say that the hook is when Andy uses the whip to knock the gun out of the hand of the man pointing it at him, the whole sequence between him in the plane flying away should be considered the hook. The sequence itself has nothing to do with the main conflict, but brilliantly introduces the protagonist, grabs the viewer, and kicks off the rivalry between Indy and Belloc. The first eighth of the story, from the hook to this turning point, is all set up. Readers are familiarizing themselves with your characters, figuring out the characters' goals and learning the stakes. Readers need that time in order to get their bearings before the main conflict really starts heating up. It's always important to establish good reasoning to why characters are acting the way that they do, but also a reason why your readers should root for them. While it's perfectly reasonable for a person to work to make a lot of money, just so that they can stop working and live an easy life, readers are going to have a hard time connecting to those characters when that is their motivation. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the inciting event occurs when Indy is summoned from his classroom and recruited by the US government to track down the Ark of the Covenant. This scene, we see Indy in his role as a professor, and what would be considered the inciting event. Here, Indy is presented with a problem and asked to fix it, but given little information about it. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first plot point occurs when Nazis burn down Marion's bar, forcing her to escape with Indy to Cairo. Again, lots happened prior to this, but this is the moment that irrevocably launches the main character by bringing two primary characters together and sending them to the primary setting. As Indy is investigating the Lost Ark, he comes across somebody from his past that he hurt, but needs to recruit, because if he doesn't, the mid-century Germans will find the Ark first. Chapter 3. The Key Event. In How to Train Your Dragon, Hiccup discovers the Night Fury dragon he has shot down. He leaves behind the normal world, in which he has never been able to overcome the dragon, and was, therefore, the worst Viking in the village. One of the great things about this scene is that the forest is covered in a dense fog. That in of itself symbolizes entering another world. Remember to add symbols to your stories for extra layers. Chapter 4. Pinch Points. The pinch points. You may have heard of these little things called pinch points, or you might not have. Of all the important structural elements to your story, they're the most likely to be neglected. They get lost in the midst of all the exciting chatter about their bigger, flashier brethren, the plot points. But pinch points, two of them, occurring in the second act, are crucial to your story structure. The waypoint in your story, or points of interest, can break up the monotony of your story. A long trek? Nope. An ultimate destination, but with little treks along the way. A lot of confusion swirls around the subject. What are pinch points? How do they compare to plot points? Where do they belong in your story? What do they do? What happens when you neglect them? While pinch points are not critical to the flow of your story, having them keeps your reader on their toes with points of interest that can both break up the monotony and give a sense of progress and speed up to the events of the story. What are pinch points? Pinch points are comparatively small turning points that occur at the 37% mark, halfway through the first plot point and the midpoint, and the 62% mark, halfway through the midpoint and the third plot point. Of course, this doesn't mean that the scenes need to be done from the antagonist's perspective. At their most basic level, pinch points are nothing more or less than the reminder of the antagonist's force of power to stymie the protagonist's goal. Of course, this doesn't mean the scene needs to be done from the antagonist's perspective, but just seeing the ripple effects from the antagonist, or at the very least a non-protagonist. Someone who has goals that don't run against or for the protagonist. This way, it adds different directions that the plot can get pulled. Though note, it should be done carefully so as not to confuse the reader. Think of it as a multi-way tug of war. While the protag is pulling one direction, others are pulling their own. And it might have nothing to do with the protagonist. Second pinch point. What's at stake? The second pinch point has its own unique job to fulfill. This time, it serves to remind both the readers and the protagonist exactly of what's at stake. The second pinch point isn't as much about revealing new clues, although they can clearly play a part, as it is about slapping the protagonist in the face with the question of just how much he's truly willing to pay to defeat the antagonist and gain his goal. With everything that's going on, the reader can get confused about what's going on and another pinch point can reorient to the primary concern for the protagonist, as well as the protagonist for themselves. Chapter 5. The moment of truth at the midpoint. A reactive protagonist doesn't have to be a passive protagonist. One of the stickiest questions any writer is likely to face is what's the difference between a reactive protagonist and a passive protagonist? By now, you know that your protagonist needs to be reactive in the first half of the book. But isn't it also true your protagonist should never be passive? Isn't reactive kind of like passive? And if so, this passive-reactive protagonist is likely to scupper your first half of your book. At all times, our protagonist should be moving through the world. If they don't care about what happens, why should the reader? What is a passive protagonist, and why doesn't your story need one? The passive protagonist is either one who has no goal, or is making no effort to achieve this goal. If your character spends most of his time staring out the window, or observing as other people do things, that's a good sign he's lapped into passivity. Always ask yourself, what does my protagonist want in the overall story? What does he want in this scene? What is he doing to try and achieve it? In the Neil Gaiman book, Neverwhere, the main character, Richard Mayhew, starts off the story active, pushing the plot forward, but ends up on the back burner while following other characters around. But the thing is he always has a goal, and while it doesn't seem like he's doing anything to reach the goal, he was by following those other characters and their own goals. Action in the second half of your story, after the midpoint, the character is suddenly armed with enough information to allow him to start fighting back. He doesn't have to continue merely shielding himself from the antagonist force's assault. Now he understands how to pick up some rocks and start chucking them back. Here the protagonist has to make the choice for when to start the final battle, to overcome the cost of the events of before, to make that step towards the fight. Chapter 6. The climactic moment. Building up the climactic moment, the third act opens around the 75% mark in the story with your third plot point. As I discussed in structuring your novel, the third plot point is a dark moment for your character. After the victory he seemed to accomplish at the end of the second act, he experiences a reversal. The full force of the conflict, its stakes, and its thematic importance cold cocks him. It will appear as if things couldn't possibly get worse. And from an emotional standpoint, at any rate, this is true. In many ways, this will be the climax of your character's inner arc, as he rounds the corner of the lie he's been fighting throughout the book and finally comes face to face with the truth. The climactic moment is what your story has been building up to, the do or die moment for our protagonists. Here, we're giving out the emotional resolution your character has been expecting, to tie up all those loose ends we have been dangling before our readers, so that they feel like they haven't been wasting their time, and allow them to go on a satisfying journey with their characters. There might be temptations to switch things up, to do the unexpected, but I cannot caution against this strongly enough. In a way, you're telling a reader their own story to them, that the story that they're expecting is the one they're going to get. Or at the very least, a story that they can see happening takes place. If things don't turn out the way that people expect, they have to be told beforehand, though subtly, of course. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Why your book needs to be structured. Does a book need to be structured to be published? I admit it. This is a bit of a trick question. The obvious answer, after my little spiel, would seem to be yes, and it is. Stories that aren't structured don't work. The rise and fall of action are disproportionate. The story set up in the first act goes missing. The growth of the character in the second act remains unconvincing. The personal paradigm shift in the third act fails flat, and the important plot points at the quarter mark, midpoint, and three-quarter marks are less than stellar, or just missing in action altogether. What can make most sports interesting to watch is not necessarily the scoring of the points, but the fact that the players on both sides are playing according to the same set of rules. Just like sports, the rules, though they are really more like guidelines, help make the process of reading better. Because, as is seen with the standard practice of storytelling for some time, this allows the reader to enter the story in faster. Recap. In the end, we can use story structure to give our own stories good bones on which to build the rest of the interesting elements. But first, we have to learn it. Okay, everyone, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking the resources I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comments section below. Thank you very much for sticking with me until the end of the video. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. toil nor danger in that bright land to which I go.